Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Saturday, November the 3rd, and welcome to our video commentary. Well, today we're going to go back and remember the election of 1964. I have a post in my blog about this if you would like to get more additional information as well as some of the numbers with respect to that election. It was 54 years ago today that President Johnson defeated Senator Goldwater in one of the biggest landslides in American history. It was absolutely incredible. Johnson pretty much carried the whole country. He got 61% of the popular vote and something like 480 electoral votes. I mean, he pretty much swept the country. There were some southern states, Arizona, Mississippi, Alabama, that voted for Goldwater, but it was a national sweep. I mean, it was a huge victory for President Johnson. Of course, in order to understand this election, we have to go back a year before, because a year before, most people thought that this would be the re-election of President Kennedy. But of course, President Kennedy was killed in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963, setting the table for President Johnson then to seek his own term in 1964. For much of the election, President Johnson was ahead. Senator Goldwater, of course, became a controversial choice. He was an outspoken man, had very strong positions on many different issues. And, by election day, I think that the Johnson people had very effectively turned Goldwater into a dangerous, be careful with this man, he could start a war, that kind of thing. There was a very famous television commercial of that election, the famous Daisy commercial where a little girl is playing with flowers and all of a sudden nuclear bomb goes off. That was only run one time, but it was very effective to portray Barry Goldwater as a dangerous man. The great irony of 1964 is that the biggest issue, the issue that would eventually destroy the Johnson presidency, the Vietnam War, never really became an issue. And to a large extent because the Johnson administration basically kept to itself all the information and what it wanted to do with respect to Vietnam. I mean, they knew that the situation in Vietnam was falling apart, but it never became an issue during the campaign. After the election, of course, in 1965 came the escalation in Vietnam, but it was never really an issue. In 1964, Goldwater tried to talk about it, but again, not very successfully. So on election night, 1964, the election was pretty much over by 9 o'clock Central Time. I mean, it was a huge landslide for President Johnson. A couple of things about this election, though, that are interesting. Number one, the Republicans came back in 1968 and went on to win 7 of the next 10 elections. The Democrats were never the same, really, after 1964 and 1968. It just never the same party until recently when they won with President Obama. But the Democrats really were not a very effective opposition for about 10 elections. The other interesting thing about this election was the introduction of Ronald Reagan. During the campaign in October of 1964, towards the end of the campaign, Ronald Reagan, who was a private citizen at the time, gave a great speech in support of Barry Goldwater. It was called A Time for Choosing. It became one of Reagan's great speeches. You can watch it. I have a link to it on my blog. And that speech really made Reagan, in a sense, the Reagan that we know today. And after that, he became the prime candidate for governor of California. Then, of course, he was reelected in California. Then, of course, he went on to win the presidency. So the big story of 1964, not only the victory of Lyndon Johnson, but really the coming on the political scene of Ronald Reagan, who would go on to become one of the most consequential presidents in American history. 1964, a big victory for Lyndon Johnson, but a couple of years later, his presidency was pretty much consumed with Vietnam and some of the other issues of the time. Thank you for watching. We have all of these on YouTube, we have them on Twitter, and we have them on my blog. And if November the 3rd is your birthday, happy birthday. Bye-bye, everybody.